Hello, my name's John Paul and I work with Mark and David. Mark is in the room with you. I'm sorry I can't be with you. This presentation is about video-based pedagogy analysis, combining teacher, pupil and researcher perspectives. So I hope you don't mind, but I'm going to read this quote for you. It comes from a military strategist, but I'm exploring about what we can learn from military strategy in pedagogical strategy. So in trying to decide between alternative strategies, we're often faced with a comparison of apples and oranges because the choices do not address the same factors. Only with a mutual understanding of what comprises pedagogical strategy can we hope to improve our strategic dialogue. I'm really interested in this thing of strategic dialogue in education, where often we seem to be sort of talking cross purposes. I think we have different understandings of the nature of strategy, and I'm hoping this work can contribute to greater clarity in this field. Now, this is the plan for what we're going to do, and I'll launch straight into that. Afterwards, I'll be joining you over Skype. So if you have questions and comments, I'd be really interested in your thoughts about this. So this is video-based research which uses grounded theory to understand and explain the pedagogy enacted during 3 science lessons on the subject of chromatography, involving an experienced science teacher, that's David, one of the researchers as well, and a class of 13 to 14-year-old pupils. So I think this work matters because the pedagogy analysis framework which emerged from previous work and which was further refined in this study, allows subtle and complicated interactions between participants in the data to be understood and explained. So this study finished in July 2018 and took place in one secondary school in Kent in the UK. So as regards literature, there's lots that we know obviously in this field. Instructional strategy has been researched by a lot of people for a long time. So classic work, seminal work in this field might be Posner et al. 1982. But what's important, I think, is that there's no consensus exists as to what strategy means. So for example, some understand this to mean a plan, whereas others see this as a particular action like grouping. Now strategy here in this paper is understood as how means are used to try and achieve ends. And I call this a Clausewitzian understanding, drawing on understandings from the military. So in this study, strategy is understood to involve the intended, enacted and evaluated curricula. Now pedagogy is also a contested term, and here it involves elements influencing teaching and learning and the interrelationship between these elements. Now, what do we not know? In the literature, there are requests fairly regularly that teachers need effective pedagogical strategies, and yet researchers, conceptual change researchers like myself, acknowledge that researchers struggle to provide this. Current methodologies for exploring conceptual change pedagogy do not always investigate teachers' complicated thinking processes while they attempt to promote conceptual change. And we think this is problematic. Researchers may be missing data from teachers and pupils that could help them understand pedagogy better. And a pedagogy analysis framework was a finding of a previous study, but that study had several limitations. So this present study addresses some of those limitations. Now the research questions, just to read them: how can the pedagogical strategies used by participants in 3 consecutive science lessons with a class of 13-year-old pupils be understood and explained? And what are the benefits and limitations of combining video-based lesson analyses by multiple participants, where those participants are the teacher, researchers and pupils in the classroom? To give an overview of the research design, the methods used are lesson video analysis, teacher verbal protocols, pupil group verbal protocols, and researcher group interviews. And I'll give more details in a moment about all of that. The methodology is Straussian grounded theory, which has a particular interpretivist theoretical perspective that underpins it, that of symbolic interactionism, and the epistemology that underpins all of this work is social constructionism. The quote there from Clarke is, "With deep roots in symbolic interactionist sociology and pragmatist philosophy, the grounded theory method can be viewed as a theory methods package with an interpretive constructionist epistemology." The research methods used are lesson video analysis, so 3 lessons of 1 hour each on the topic of chromatography. Then the teacher watches the videos back and thinks aloud, so produces verbal protocols. Those verbal protocols are recorded on a second video. Then a group of pupils, 3 girls and 3 boys from the class, watch clips of the lesson back. We use clips for practical reasons, and think aloud, and we record that on a third video. And then finally, the 2 researchers and the teacher, so 3 researchers together, video ourselves in a retrospective conversation about the coding. The methodology is Straussian grounded theory. So this is a systematic set of procedures to develop an inductively derived grounded theory about a phenomenon. I won't read out all those procedures, and because we're short on time, I'm not planning on going through the procedures now with you. I'm going to assume that people are okay with grounded theory, or will question me at the end if you'd like me to go over any of those procedures. Now, participants in this study were a convenience sample, so 1 secondary science teacher, a physics specialist, and 1 class of 13 to 14-year-old pupils from Year 9 in UK participated. The teacher was recruited from among 211 secondary school science advanced skills teachers in the UK. The 3 pupil group verbal protocol interviews were with 6 volunteers from the class, 3 girls and 3 boys. And the sample size needed to be balanced against the depth of analysis. So as the theoretical perspective is interpretive, a small sample was used so that data could be examined in considerable detail. Approximately 15 hours of video were analysed. So as regards ethics, the BERA guidelines were followed. We're not using any images of pupils in publications. We only refer to pupils by their initials. Informed consent and assent was sought from the teacher, formal permission from the head teacher as a gatekeeper, and data was held securely. Right, so as regards findings, pedagogical strategy, like military strategy, resembles a bridge between the means, now those are human means, like people in the classroom, and non-human resources, like things that the pupils used. So it's a bridge between the means a participant has at their disposal and the ends they seek. Now the ends could be personal, political, or logistical. So each participant's means, strategies, and ends are continuously adjusted and or abandoned as the information, misinformation, and disinformation available to them changes, and as accidents are addressed. And I'll say more about accidents in a moment. The strategic spectrum varies from the micro scale, like actions. Now an action could be something like a pupil putting up their hand, through the meso scale, which would be a sequence of actions, a tactic. So that could be a question and answer sequence, for example, to a macro scale, and that's how each participant uses their localized understanding to try and achieve systemic change. Now, I call that grand strategy in this work. So ends can be personal, cognitive, affective, conative, or social, political, now that's politics internal to the classroom and also external, or logistical. Now logistical is just how we make sure that the means that we need to teach are available at the right place and the right time. And accidents are when things go wrong. And in questions, if you'd like to come back to any of this, please feel free. This is a visual representation of the pedagogy analysis framework that emerged from previous work, and we're refining in this work. And I'll just give you a bit of time to look at that now. Okay. Here's the final coding grid. I'll give you a moment to have a look at that. The main thing this study is adding to the pedagogy analysis framework are the types of tactics. Okay. This pedagogy profile gives you some idea of the number of times that elements within the pedagogy analysis framework come up. As you can see, some things don't come up very often. For example, disinformation is quite rare in the lessons that we studied in comparison to tactics, loads and loads of tactics used in these data. But just because something is not used very often doesn't mean it's not significant as regards the pedagogy. This gives a rough idea. These are coding stripes from NVivo software. Just gives you a rough idea of just how rich these data are, that lots of elements of the pedagogy analysis framework were used simultaneously. So as regards originality, firstly, a video-based grounded theory study of classroom pedagogy from an interpretivist theoretical perspective and using a constructionist epistemology would appear from my investigations to be unique. Secondly, combining verbal protocols and retrospective debriefing is uncommon in the research literature. Therefore, combining verbal protocols and researcher group interviews with lesson video analysis by the teacher, a group of pupils and researchers, constitutes an original approach. Finally, the Clausewitzian understanding of pedagogical strategy does not support the idea of strategy being merely a plan for a teacher to implement. The strategy as plan view is prevalent in educational literature and among teachers. So debate continues about rigour in qualitative research like this. Now, the validity of evidence ought to be considered by the criteria of the theoretical perspective that underpins the research. And we argue that the techniques of Lincoln and Goober 1985 to ensure credibility, transferability, dependability and confirmability used alongside grounded theory methods can give trustworthy evidence. Video evidence with a complete auditable record on NVivo provides transparency in the research process. I argue that this work is significant because the framework for interpreting pedagogical strategy which has emerged could help strategic dialogue between teachers and researchers, could help experienced practitioners understand their own practice better, and could be useful for video-supported reflection, particularly in ITE work, initial teacher education work. Now, working from multiple perspectives, having three of us coding these data, means that participants construct knowledge together, and it rejects the individualistic, isolated knower from constructivism. It acknowledges unique perspectives and insights of participants, and it increases the credibility. It allows researcher triangulation, peer debriefing, and inter-rater checks. But obviously there's difficulties with using multiple perspectives in this sort of work. There's some divergence in interpretations, but there's lots of divergence as well. But that's been really interesting, working together on that and exploring about how to analyse these data and what does findings of this mean. I'm very aware that this presentation is giving very much, my slant on my understanding of these data, and it's great that Mark is there, that you'll be able to talk with him afterwards about his approach to these data. So the analysis is painstaking. This sort of work does take a long time, and there are lots of logistical difficulties in doing this sort of work with video. Any of you familiar with video analysis will be familiar with. So conclusions. The finding of this work is a refinement of the pedagogy analysis framework. That's a substantive grounded theory, not a formal grounded theory. Addressing limitations in previous work may help teachers and researchers understand and explain strategy used by participants in school lessons. The research design accesses some of the complicated thinking processes of the teacher and some of the pupils while they explain how they understand incidents in these data. The terms in the pedagogy analysis framework may help strategic dialogue between teachers and researchers. Research designs for exploring pedagogy which take into account the perspectives of teacher, pupils and researchers may help address the gap between conceptual change research and instructional practice identified in the literature. Now for next steps, it's interesting, we think, to explore this sort of research design with other subjects, and I'm just starting a study that involves exploring science and religion encounters in both primary and secondary schools. Another thing that we've just put a research bid in for is to explore about early career pedagogy evolution, to follow teachers in the first few years of their practice, where they do video analysis for their own practice, supported by us as researchers, to see what happens in those years as people's teachers' understanding of their own pedagogy deepens. I'm particularly interested in disinformation, and I think there's potential for exploring classroom deception in more depth. Something I've written a little bit about before, but I'd like to revisit that. And then understanding accidents in the data. Accidents are sometimes just unfortunate things that happen during a classroom, a piece of equipment breaks or something like that. But it's been fascinating to see how accidents are used by experienced teachers in classrooms, how often this can become a spur for learning. We're also really interested in exploring the potential of complexity theory to aid understanding of this complex social network. And obviously Mark is with you and he's a specialist in that area, so he'll be presenting his own work on that as well as part of the conference. And we're also interested in looking at strategic decision making. So I don't have time in a presentation like this to share with you, these data, which is a terrible shame, but here's one quote. This is a pupil aged 13 to 14 in one of the pupil verbal protocol interviews. She said, "I think we always knew these lessons were all effective, but we never knew why. So these sort of sessions have been interesting to sort of see the little things that made it impactful." Brief bibliography. Please email me if you'd like a full bibliography or the paper. Thank you very much for listening. If you have any questions or comments, we'd be delighted to hear those now. Bye-bye.